One coffin stood open, its lid up against the wall and its side hinged down. This seemed to be the one destined for Bond. The Negro was draping a heavy, unclean-looking sheet over it and smoothing it down to form a lining to the box. When he'd finished, he went to the middle of the room and chose 2 from a line of pails, filled to the top with steaming dark brown mud, and dropped them with a double clang beside the open box. Then he dug his huge hand into one of them and smeared the thick, viscous stuff along the bottom of the shroud, and went on doing this until the whole bottom of it was 2 inches thick with mud. He turned and beckoned to Bond. "Okay, mister," he said. "You ever had one of these before?" "No." Thought maybe not, so I'm giving you the mud at 110. If you're acclimated, you can take 120 or even 130. Lie down there." Bond gingerly climbed into the box and lay down, his skin smarting at its first contact with the hot mud. When he was settled, the Negro dug both hands into one of the buckets of fresh mud and proceeded to slap it all over Bond's body. At last, the Negro had finished, and Bond was loaded with hot mud. Only his face and an area around his heart were still white. With a swift movement, the Negro bent down and picked up the edges of the sheet and wrapped them tightly round Bond's body and his arms. Bond could just move his fingers and his head, but otherwise he had less freedom of movement than in a straitjacket. Then the man closed the open side of the coffin, lowered the heavy wooden lid, and that was that. The Negro took a slate down from the wall above Bond's head and glanced at a clock high up on the far wall and scribbled the time down. It was just 6 o'clock. 20 minutes, he said. "Feel good?" Bond gave a neutral grunt. At 3 minutes past 6, the door opened to admit the naked, scrawny figure of Ting-a-ling Bell. He had a sharp, weaselly face and a miserable body on which each bone showed. He walked cockily into the middle of the room. "Hey, Ting-a-ling," said the man with the cauliflower ear. "Heard you had some trouble today. Too bad." "Them stewards is a heap of obscenity," said Ting-a-ling sourly. "Hey, you bastard, you gotta get 6 ounces off me. Just had me a plate of French fried." The Negro chuckled fatly. "Don't worry, baby," he said affectionately. "I can always break your arm off. Got your weight down easy that way. Be right with you." Bond looked at the clock. Another 10 minutes in the mud. The Negro sauntered across with the cold towels over his arm and wrapped one round Bond's hair and forehead. It was a delicious relief. The seconds ticked by. The jockey, with a crackle of obscenities, lowered himself into the box directly in front of Bond, and Bond guessed that he was being given the mud at 130 degrees. He was wound up in the shroud, and the lid was banged shut over him. The Negro wrote 6:15 on the jockey's slate. Bond closed his eyes and wondered how he was going to slip the man his money. In the restroom after the bath, or in the passage on the way out, or in the bus? No, better not be seen with him. "All right, nobody move now. Just take it easy and no one will get hurt." Bond's eyes snapped open and his body tingled at the reek of danger that had come into the room. The door to the outside was standing open. A man stood in the opening and another man was advancing into the middle of the room. They both had guns in their hands and they both had black hoods over their heads with holes cut for the eyes and mouth. There was silence in the room except for the sound of water falling in the shower cubicles. Each cubicle contained a naked man. They peered out into the room through the veil of water. The moving man with a gun was now in the middle of the floor by the steaming pails of mud. He stopped in front of the Negro, who was standing with a full bucket in each hand. The Negro quivered slightly so that the handle on one of the buckets gave out a slight rattle. Suddenly, with a backhanded blow that had all his shoulder behind it, the man lashed the butt of the revolver into the center of the Negro's huge belly. The buckets crashed to the floor as the Negro's 2 hands leapt up and clutched at himself. He let out a soft moan and sagged forward onto his knees. The man with the gun walked across to where Bond was lying, toe to head with Ting-a-ling Bell. He came up and looked first down at Bond's face. He seemed to stiffen. 2 glittering eyes looked down through the diamond slits in the black hood. Then the man moved to the left and stood over the jockey. "Well, well, damn if it ain't Ting-a-ling Bell." "What's the matter?" "Maybe you never heard of a horse called Shy Smile, Ting-a-ling. Maybe you weren't there when he was rode foul at around 2:30 this afternoon." The jockey started to cry softly. "Jesus, Buzz, that weren't my fault. Happened to anybody." "My friends figure it may have been a double-cross. My friends figure a jock like you could only have done something like that intentional. My friends looked over your room and found a grand plugged away in a lamp socket. My friends wish me to inquire where that lettuce come from. The sharp slap and the shrill cry were simultaneous. "Gimme, you bastard, or I'll blow your brains out." A stammering scream came out of the box. "It's my wad, all I got. Headed away in the lamp. My wad, I swear it. Christ, you gotta believe me. You gotta." The man gave a disgusted grunt and lifted his gun so that it came into Bond's line of vision. A thumb with a big angry wart on the first joint eased the hammer back. The man looked into the jockey's face and his voice went slimy. "You've been riding too much lately, Ting-a-ling," he almost whispered. "You're in bad shape. Need a rest. Plenty of quiet, like in a sanitarium or something." Bond saw him reach down and pick up one of the steaming buckets of mud. The man came back, holding the bucket low, still talking, still reassuring. "Like I said, Ting-a-ling, plenty of quiet. Nothing to eat for a while. It's a nice, shady room with the drapes drawn to keep out the light." Slowly the arm came up, higher and higher. And then the jockey could see the bucket and he knew what was going to happen and he started moaning. "No, no, 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 no." The black stuff steamed as it poured sluggishly out of the bucket. The man stepped swiftly aside and hurled the empty bucket at the man with the cauliflower ear. And then he moved fast across the room to where the other man with the gun stood near the door. He turned. "No funny business, no cops. Phone's busted. Better dig the guy out before his eyeballs fry." The door banged, and there was silence except for a bubbling sound and the noise of the water gushing in the shower. Then what happened? Leiter was sitting in Bond's chair in the motel, and Bond was pacing up and down the room. "Chaos," said Bond. "Everybody yammering to be let out of his box, and the man with the cauliflower ear hosing the stuff off Ting-a-ling's face. The Negro moaning on the floor, and the naked guys from the showers teetering about like chickens with their heads cut off. Then one of the naked went around opening the boxes and letting the people out, and there we were, 20 men covered with mud and only one shower to spare. It gradually got sorted out." "Was there anything that struck you about these two guys?" asked Leiter. "Height, clothes, anything else?" "Well, I couldn't see much of the man by the door," said Bond. "The other man, the one who did the job, was a big, fattish guy. Black trousers, brown shirt with white stripes, no coat or tie. Oh, yes," Bond suddenly remembered. "He had a wart on the top joint of his right thumb." "Wint," said Leiter flatly. "And the other guy was Kid. Always worked together. They're the top torpedoes for the Spangs. Wint is a mean bastard, a real sadist. He's always sucking at that wart on his thumb. He's called Windy. Not to his face, that is. Kid's got white hair, although he's only 30. That's one of the reasons they like to work in hoods. Guess I'll get along to the cops and tip them off. I won't mention you, of course. But I'll give them the lowdown on Shy Smile, and I'll find out where they've taken Ting-a-ling, and we'll mail the dough to him there. Might cheer him up a bit, poor little bastard. Be seeing you." Bond stripped and spent 10 minutes under the shower. Then he dressed in trousers and shirt and went over to the telephone booth in the reception hall and put in a call to Shady Tree. The high, thin voice of the hunchback came over the phone. "Yeah, who's calling?" "James Bond." "Yes?" Shy's smile didn't pay off. "I know, the jockey pitched it, so what?" "Money," said Bond. "Heard again, I'll wire you $1,000. The $1,000 you won off me, remember?" "Yes." "Now listen carefully. You're to get it at Las Vegas. Come down to New York and pick up a plane. Charge the ticket to me. You have a reservation at the Tiara. Find your way around, and now listen to this carefully. At just 5 after 10 on Thursday evening, go to the center of the 3 blackjack tables at the Tiara on the side of the room near the bar. You got that?" "Yes." "Sit down and play the maximum. That's $1,000 5 times. Then get up and quit the table and don't gamble anymore. You hear me?" "Yes." "Your check is paid at the Tiara. After the game, hang around and wait for further instructions. You got that? Repeat." Bond did so. "Check," said the hunchback. "Don't talk and don't make a mistake. We don't like mistakes." There was a soft click. Bond put down the receiver and walked thoughtfully across the lawn to his room, where Leiter joined him and brought him up to date. The Spangled boys had all checked out. Pissarro, Bud, Wint, Kid. "The FBI are on the case now," said Leiter. "But without you as a witness, nobody's going to have any idea who the 2 gunmen were, and I'm surprised if the FBI got very worked up about Pissarro and his horse. They'll leave that to me and my outfit. I've talked to head office, and they've told me to get out to Vegas and somehow find out where the remains of the real Shy Smile are buried. I've got to lay my hands on his teeth. How'd you like that?" "So you're going to Las Vegas, too," said Bond. "Funny coincidence, Department." He told Leiter about his conversation with Shady Tree. "Sure," said Leiter. "No coincidence about it. We're both traveling bad roads, and all bad roads lead to the bad town. Shan't be able to see much of you right under the Spang nose, but maybe we could meet up from time to time and exchange notes. Tell you what," he added, "we got a good man there, undercover. Cab driver by the name of Correo, Ernie Correo. He's a good guy. And I'll pass the word you're coming, and he'll look after you." In Las Vegas, the heat hit Bond's face like a fist. As he pushed his way out of the airport, a voice behind him said, "You for the Tiara?" A chunky man with large, very direct brown eyes under a chauffeur's peaked cap shot the question at him from a wide mouth from which a wooden toothpick jutted. "Yes." "Okay, let's go." Bond followed him over to a smart-looking Chevrolet, threw his suitcase into the back, and climbed in after it. The car moved off and out of the airport onto the parkway. Bond felt himself being examined in the driving mirror. He looked up at the driver's identification tag. It said, "Ernest Correo, number 2584. "I believe you're a friend of Felix Leiter." "Sure," said the driver over his shoulder. "Nice guy. Told me to watch out for you. Staying long?" "I can't say," said Bond. "Few days, anyway." "Tell you what," said the driver. "Don't think I'm trying to gyp you, but if we're going to do some work together and you got some dough, maybe you better hire the cab by the day. $50, but I gotta make a living. It'll make sense to the front boys of the hotels and so on. Like that, they'll understand me hanging about waiting for you half the day. They're a suspicious lot of bastards on the strip." "Couldn't be better. It's a deal." "Okay." The driver expanded a little. "You see, Mr. Bond, the folks around here don't like anything out of the ordinary. They're suspicious. I mean, yeah, you look like anything except a tourist who's come to lose his wad, and, well, I get a bad case of nose trouble." They were just entering the famous strip. "Coming into the strip now," said the driver. "Otherwise known as Rue de la Paix, spelt P-A-Y. Joke. See?" "Got it," said Bond. "On your right, the Flamingo," said Ernie Correo as they passed a low-lying, modernistic hotel with a huge tower of neon, now dead, outside it. "And that dump with the flat iron sign is the Sahara. Latest thing. Listed owners are a bunch of small-time gamblers from Oregon. That's a dummy western town on the left, worth seeing. And over there is the Thunderbird, and across the road's Tiara. Snazziest joint in Vegas. Guess you know about Mr. Spang and all that." He slowed down and halted opposite the Spang Hotel, which was topped by a ducal coronet of brilliant lights that winked on and off in a lost battle with the glaring sun and the reflections from the highway. Bond suddenly felt he'd had enough of the ghastly glitter of the strip. He only wanted to get indoors and out of the heat, have some lunch and perhaps a swim, and take things easy until the night. He said so. "Suits me," said Correo. "Guess you shouldn't get into much trouble your first night. Take it easy and act kind of natural. If you got work to do in Vegas, you better wait till you know your way around. And watch the gambling, friend." As Bond shouldered his way through the glass doors of the Tiara, he heard Ernie Correo say to the porter, "Some crazy limey, hire me for $50 a day. What do you know about that?" And then the door swung to behind him, and the beautiful cold air welcomed him with a chill kiss into the glittering palace of the man called Serafimo Spang. Bond sat at the long bar of the Tiara and sipped a vodka martini and examined the great gambling room with a professional eye. He beckoned to the barman. "Mr. Spang been around tonight?" "Ain't seen him," said the barman. "Mostly comes in after the first show, around 11. You know him?" Not personally." Bond paid his check and drifted over to the blackjack tables. He stopped at the center one. This one would be his. At exactly 5 minutes past 10, he glanced at his watch. 8:30. The table was a small, flat kidney of green baize. 8 players sat on high stools facing the dealer, who stood with his stomach against the edge of the table and dealt 2 cards into the 8 numbered spaces on the cloth in front of the stakers. The stakes were mostly 5 or 10 silver dollars or counters worth 20. The dealer was a man of about 40. He had a pleasant half smile on his face. He wore the dealer's uniform, white shirt buttoned at the wrists, a thin black Western gambler's tie, a green eyeshade, black trousers. There was no talk at the table except when a player ordered a courtesy drink from one of the waitresses in black silk pajamas who circulated in the central space inside the ring of tables. From this central space, the run of the play was watched over by 2 tough, lynx-eyed pit bosses with guns at their waists. The game was quick and efficient and dull. Bond watched for a while and then walked through to the restaurant. The hostess swept over and piloted him to a corner table. She bent over to arrange the flowers in the middle of the table and to show him that her fine bosom was at least half real, gave him a gracious smile and went away. After 10 minutes, a waitress with a tray appeared and put a roll on his plate and a square of butter. Then a second and older waitress bustled over and gave him the menu and said, "Be right with you." 20 minutes after he'd sat down, Bond was able to order a dozen cherry-stone clams and a steak, and, since he expected a further long pause, a second vodka dry martini. "The wine waiter'll be right over," said the waitress primly, and disappeared in the direction of the kitchen. Long on courtesy and short on service, reflected Bond, and resigned himself to the gracious ritual. During the excellent dinner that finally materialized, Bond wondered about the evening ahead. There were two ways of playing the rest of the game: by lying low and waiting for something to happen, or by forcing the pace so that something had to happen. By 10 o'clock, the scene in the big gambling room had changed. It was much quieter. The orchestra had gone, and there were only a few players at the tables. And something else had changed. The dealer at the center blackjack table nearest the bar was Tiffany Case. So that was her job at the Tiara. And then Bond saw that all the blackjack dealers were pretty women, and that they were all dressed in the same smart Western outfit, in grey and black, a grey sombrero hanging down the back by a black cord, black half Wellingtons over flesh-colored nylons. Bond looked at his watch again and moved slowly into the room. So Tiffany was going to false deal him to win $5,000. And of course they'd chosen the moment when she'd just come on duty, and the first show of the big-name revue was still running in the Platinum Room. He would be alone with her at the table. At exactly 5 minutes past 10, Bond strolled easily up to the table and sat down facing her. "Good evening." "Hi." She gave him a thin, correct smile. What's the maximum?" "$1,000." As Bond slapped the $100 notes down across the betting line, the pit boss strolled over and stood beside Tiffany Case. "Maybe that guy would like a new deck, Miss Tiffany," he said. He handed her a fresh pack. The girl stripped the cover off it and snapped the pack with a fluid motion of the hands, broke it, and put the two halves flat on the table and executed what appeared to be a faultless shuffle. But Bond saw that the two halves did not quite marry, that when she lifted the pack off the table and carried out an innocent reshuffle, she would be getting the two halves of the pack back into their original order. He looked up into her grey eyes. Was there a hint of amusement at the odd game they were playing across the narrow green board? She dealt him 2 cards and then gave 2 to herself. Printed across the table were the words, "The dealer must draw on 16 and stand on 17. He glanced at his 2 cards, a knave and a 10. He looked up at the girl and shook his head. She turned up 16 and drew a card, busting herself with a king. She had a rack beside her which contained only silver dollars and counters for 20, but the pit boss was quickly at her side with a $1,000 plaque. She took it and tossed it over to Bond. He put it over the line and pocketed his notes. She flipped out 2 more cards to him and 2 to herself. Bond had 17 and again shook his head. She had 12 and drew a 3 and then a 9, 24, and bust again. Again the pit boss stepped up with a plaque. Bond slipped it into his pocket and left his original stake. This time he had 19, and she turned up a 10 and a 7, on which, by the rule, she had to stand. Another plaque went into Bond's pocket. The wide doors at the far end of the room had opened, and a stream of people were milling into the gambling room from the dinner review. She was looking at him impatiently. She quickly dealt him 2 more cards, just as 3 more players came up to the table and hitched themselves up on the stools. He had 19, and she had 16. And that was that. The pit boss didn't even bother to hand the girl the 4th plaque, but tossed it across the table to Bond with an expression on his face that was very like a sneer. Bond looked across the table at the girl. "Thank you," he said. "You deal beautifully." Tiffany Case looked hard at Bond. "You're welcome," she said. She held his eyes for a fraction of a second and then looked down at her cards, shuffled them thoroughly, and handed them to one of the new players for a cut. Bond turned his back on the table and moved off to the bar. So now he'd been paid off, and Shady Tree had told him on no account to go back to the tables. Bond finished his drink and walked straight across the room to the nearest roulette table. There was only a sprinkling of gamblers at it, playing small. "What's the maximum here?" he said to the stick man, an elderly, balding individual with dead eyes who was just picking the ivory ball out of the wheel. $5 grand, said the man indifferently. Bond took the 4 plaques and the $100 notes out of his pocket and put them beside the croupier. On red. The croupier sat up straighter in his chair. Bond saw his knee go up under the table. The pit boss heard the buzzer and strolled over to the table just as the croupier spun the wheel. Bond took out a cigarette and lit it. His hand was steady. He felt a wonderful sense of freedom at having at last taken the initiative from these people. He knew he was going to win. The little ivory ball rattled into its slot. 36, red, high and even. The stick man raked in a few losing counters and silver dollars and tossed some money down the table to the winners. Then he took a thin plaque as big as a prayer book out of his rack and put it softly down beside Bond. Black, said Bond. Several more people drifted up and stood watching. Bond felt the curious eyes on him, but he only looked across the table into the eyes of the pit boss. They were as hostile as an adder's, and yet somehow scared. Bond smiled blandly at him. 17, black, low and odd, said the stick man. There was a sigh from the crowd, and hungry eyes watched the big plaque being slipped out of the rack and placed in front of Bond. Once more, thought Bond, but not this turn. I'll stay away, he said to the croupier. And then there was another man inside the pit, standing beside the pit boss, and he was looking at Bond with bright, hard eyes like camera lenses, and the fat cigar exactly in the center of his red lips was pointing straight at Bond like a gun. The big, square body in the midnight blue tuxedo was quite motionless, and a sort of tense quietness exuded from it. The face was ivory pale, but there was a likeness to the brother in London in the very straight, angry black brows, and the short cliff of wiry hair cut en brosse, and in the ruthless jut of the jaw. The wheel whirred again. It fell into one of the 2 green slots in the wheel, and Bond's heart lifted at the escape he'd had. 00, said the stick man, raking in all the money on the table. Now for the last throw, thought Bond. And then out of here with $20,000 of the Spang money. Red. He handed a $5,000 plaque to the croupier and watched it slither down the table. Would the last coup be asking too much of the wheel? No, decided Bond with certitude. It would not. 5, red, low and odd, said the croupier obediently. I'll take the stake, said Bond, and thanks for the ride. Come again, said the stick man unemotionally. Bond walked straight across the long room to the cashier's desk. 3 bills of 5,000 and 5 of 1s, he said to the man with the green eyeshade behind the bars. The man took Bond's 4 plaques and counted out the bills, and Bond put them in his pocket and walked over to the reception desk. Airmail envelope, please, he said. He put the 3 big bills in the envelope and wrote on the front, Personal, the Managing Director, Universal Export, Regent's Park, London, Northwest 1, England. Then he bought stamps at the desk and slipped the envelope down the slot marked U.S. Mail and hoped that there, in the most sacrosanct repository in America, it would be safe. How'd you make out? It was the next evening, and Ernie Cureo's cab was rolling slowly along the strip towards downtown Las Vegas. Bond had called up the Pinkerton man and suggested they get together for a talk. Not bad, said Bond. Took some money off them at roulette, but I don't suppose that'll worry our friend. They tell me he's got plenty to spare. I'll say. Well, what's he spend it on? Oh, he's just crazy about the Old West. He bought himself a whole ghost town way out on Highway 95. He's rebuilt the whole place. Wooden sidewalks, fancy saloon, even the old railroad station. Way back in '05 or thereabouts, this dump, Specterville it's called, was a rare in silver camp. They dug millions out of those mountains, and a spur line took the stuff into Rhyolite. That's another famous ghost town. Used to be the railhead where the stuff got shipped to the coast. Well, Spang bought himself one of the old locos and one of the first Pullman stagecoaches, and he keeps them there in the station at Specterville, and weekends he takes his pals for a run into Rhyolite and back. Drives the train himself, yes, sir. That's how Mr. Spang spends his money. So that explained it, thought Bond. That was why he'd heard nothing from Mr. Spang or his friends all through the day. Friday, and they'd be all out at the boss's place, playing trains. Ernie Cureo's voice broke sharply in on his thoughts. Hey, we got ourselves a tail, mister. 2 of them, fore and aft. See that black Chevy sedan in front with the 2 guys? Well, they've been watching us and keeping step for quite a while. Back of us is a little red sports model, Jag. 2 more guys with golf clubs in the back. But it just happens I know them guys. Golf ain't their game. The only irons they can handle are in their pockets. Hold tight, let's go. Suddenly, Ernie Curie put his brakes full on and dry-skidded to a stop with a scream of his tires. There was a shattering splinter of metal and glass as the Jaguar hit their fenders. The cab lurched forward against its brakes, and then the driver jammed it into gear and, with a horrible tearing of iron, freed himself from the smashed radiator of the car behind and accelerated away down the road. There was a clang and two sharp cracks as they flashed past the Chevrolet. A handful of safety glass showered around Bond. Ernie Curio swore, and the car gave a swerve and then got back on its course. Bond knelt on the back seat and knocked out the glass of the rear window with the butt of his gun. The Chevrolet was coming after them, its eyes blazing. "Hold it," said Curio in an odd, muffled voice. "I'm gonna do a sharp turn and stop under cover the next block. Give you a clear shot as they come around after us." Bond braced himself as the tires screamed, and the car lurched on two wheels and then righted itself and stopped. Then he was out of the door and crouching with his gun up. The lights of the Chevrolet tore into the side road, and there was a squeal of tortured rubber as it made the turn on the wrong side. Now, thought Bond, before he can straighten up. Crack! A pause. Crack, crack, crack! 4 bullets at 20 yards, dead on the target. The Chevrolet did not straighten up. It went over the curb on the other side of the road, smashed into a lamp stand, and then turned completely round and slowly toppled over on its side. As Bond watched it, waiting for the echoes of the smashing metal to stop ringing in his ears, flames started to bleed slowly from the chromium mouth of the car. Someone was scrabbling at a window, trying to get out. Bond had started to cross the road when there was a groan from the front seat of the cab, and he turned round to see Ernie Curio slip from under the wheel to the floor. Bond forgot the burning car as he tore open the door of the cab and leant over the driver. There was blood everywhere, and the whole of the driver's left arm was soaked in it. "Oh, brother," he said through clenched teeth. "Get me out of here, mister, and drive like hell. Next thing that Jag will be after us. Then get me to a medic." "Okay, Annie," said Bond, slipping behind the wheel. "I'll take care of it." "Keep going," muttered Ernie Curio. "See anything in the mirror?" "No, there's a low-slung car with a spotlight coming after us fast," said Bond. "Could be the Jag. About 2 blocks away now." He stamped on the accelerator, and the car hissed through the deserted side street. "Keep going," said Ernie Curio. "We gotta hide up someplace and let them lose us. Tell you what, drive-in movie. See those lights? Get in there quick. Straight over the sand between those cars. Off lights. Easy. Stop." The car came to rest in the back row of half a dozen ranks of cars lined up to face the concrete screen that soared up into the sky and on which a huge man was just saying something to a huge girl. Bond turned and looked back down the lanes of metal standards like parking meters from which speakers could be connected with your car to pick up the sound. As he watched, 1 or 2 cars drove in and ranged themselves in the rear rank. "Won't be long, Ernie. Try and stick it." Bond turned and strained his eyes across the dark expanse behind him. Still nothing. He glanced at the neighboring cars. 2 faces glued together. 2 prim, rapt, elderly faces staring upwards. And then a dark figure rose up from the ground, and a gun was in his face, and a voice on the other side of the car beside Ernie Curio whispered softly, "Okay, fellas, take it easy." Bond looked into the suety face beside him. The eyes were smiling and cold. "Out, Limey, or your pal's cold turkey. My friend has a silencer. You and we are going for a little ride." "Okay, Annie," Bond said. "Better 1 than 2. I'll go with them. I'll soon be back to get you to the dock. Take care of yourself." "Sorry, friend," said Ernie Curio in a tired voice. "I guess..." But then there was a sharp thud as the gun hit him behind the ear, and he slumped forward and was silent. Bond stepped slowly out of the car. "Go ahead to the gate," said Suet-Face softly. "Look natural. I got you covered." The red Jaguar with its shattered windshield was outside the entrance, up against the wall of the enclosure. Bond let them take his gun and climbed in beside the driver. "Nice little car you once had," said Bond. "Where are we going in the remains?" "You'll see," said the driver, a bony man with a cruel mouth and sideburns. He swung the car out onto a 2-lane highway that ribboned away across the moonlit desert towards the mountains. There was a big sign which said 95, and Bond remembered what Ernie Curio had told him and knew that he was on his way to Specterville. 2 hours later, they drew up among the grey clapboard houses and shops marked Drugs, Barber, Farmers Bank, and Wells Fargo, under a hissing gaslight outside a two-story building which said in faded gold, Pink Garter Saloon. From behind the traditional sawn-off swing doors, yellow light streamed out onto the street. The whole scene was like something out of an exceptionally well-mounted western. "Out, Limey," said the driver. "Yeah, come on, sissy," said the other man, giving him a nudge with his loosely held gun. Bond limped heavily as he followed the man to the door of the saloon. He paused as the swing doors flapped back into his face. He felt the prod of the driver's gun from behind. Now, Bond straightened himself and leapt through the still swinging door. His hands shot out and caught the man in front above the elbows. He lifted him off his feet and swung him round and into the swing doors and into the driver, who was halfway through them. The whole clapboard house trembled as the two bodies met, and the driver fell back through the doors and crashed onto the sidewalk. The other man's gun clattered to the floor. Bond was on him like a panther, raining in blows to the body until the gangster began to sag. Then he put out all his strength, made almost a full turn to gather momentum, and slung the body sideways into the room. There was a first twanging crash as the flying figure hit the upright pianola, and then, with an explosion of metallic discords and breaking wood, the dying instrument toppled over, and with the unconscious gangster spread-eagled across it, thundered to the floor. Amidst the diminishing crescendo of echoes, Bond stood in the center of the room, the breath rasping in his throat. "Cut!" It was a girl's voice, and it came from the direction of the bar. Bond turned slowly round. 4 people had come into the saloon. They were standing in line with their backs to the mahogany and brass bar. A step in front of the other 3 stood the leading citizen of Spectreville, resplendent, motionless, dominant. Mr. Spang was dressed in full Western costume down to the long silver spurs on his polished black boots. His big head was thrust slightly forward, and his eyes were cold, fierce slits. On Mr. Spang's right, with her hands on her hips, was Tiffany Case. In a Western dress of white and gold, she looked like something out of Annie Get Your Gun. The other half of the quartet were the 2 men in black hoods from Saratoga. Each of them held a gun trained on Bond's heaving stomach. Mr. Spang broke the silence. "Bring him over." There was a faint jingle of spurs on the wooden floor as Mr. Spang left the room. With a last look at Bond, a look that held some message that was more than the obvious warning, the girl followed him. The 2 men came up to Bond, and the big one said, "You heard?" Bond walked slowly after the girl, and the 2 men lined up behind him. There was a door behind the bar. Bond pushed through it and found himself on a plank station platform. And then Bond stopped in his tracks and hardly noticed a sharp prod in the ribs from a gun barrel. It was probably the most beautiful train in the world. Its polished brass handrails and heavy warning bell above the long, gleaming barrel of the boiler glittered under the hissing gaslights of the station. Above the 2 tall driving wheels in fine early Victorian gold capitals was written, "The Cannonball." Coupled to the tender was a maroon-colored state Pullman. "Guess you never seen nothing like that, Limey," said one of the guards proudly. "Now get going." His voice was muffled by the black silk hood. The interior of the Pullman glittered with Victorian luxury. At the far end of the stateroom, with his back to a small open fireplace, flanked by bookshelves gleaming richly with gold-tooled leather bindings, stood Mr. Spang. In a red leather armchair near a small writing desk, Tiffany Case sat bolt upright. Bond didn't care for the way she was holding her cigarette. It was nervous and artificial. It looked frightened. Bond took a few steps down the car to a comfortable chair. He turned it round to face them both and sat down and crossed one knee over the other. He took out his cigarette case and lit a cigarette. Mr. Spang had an unlighted cigar jutting from the exact center of his mouth. He took it out. "Stay here, Wint. Kid, get along and do what I said. Now you." His eyes glittered angrily at Bond. "Who are you and what's going on?" "I'll need a drink if we're going to talk," said Bond. "Get him a drink, Wint." Bond half turned his head. "Bourbon and branch water," he said. "Half and half." The drink came, and the guard thrust it into his hand so that some of it slopped onto the carpet. "Thank you, Wint," said Bond. He took a deep swallow. "I just don't like being leaned on," he said easily. "I did my job and got paid. Now, if I chose to gamble with the money, that was my affair. I could have lost. And then a lot of your men started breathing down my neck, and I got impatient." "You don't get the message, fella," Mr. Spang said softly. "Maybe I better bring you up to date. Got a coded signal yesterday from London. His hand went to the breast pocket of his black western shirt, and he slowly pulled out a piece of paper. It says, reliably informed Peter Franks held by police on unspecified charge. Endeavor at all costs hold substitute carrier. Ascertain if operations endangered. Eliminate him and report. Mr. Spang's eyes rose from the paper and glittered redly down on Bond. Well, Mr. Hoosers, this looks like a good year for something horrible to happen to you. He looked over Bond's head at the guard. Went, get kid, and come back with the boots. The boots? Bond sat silent, gathering his strength and his courage. He looked across at Tiffany. Her head was bent. She was looking carefully at her fingernails. Bond heard the two guards come up behind him. Take him out on the platform. Brooklyn stomping, 80%er. K? Okay, boss. It was the voice belonging to Wint. It sounded greedy. The two hooded men came up and sat down side by side on a dark red chaise longue. They put football boots down on the thick carpet beside them and started to unlace their shoes. The black frogman's suit fitted tightly. It hurt everywhere. And it was very dark under the sea, and the currents were strong, pulling him against the coral. But now something had got him by the arm. What the hell? James. For Christ's sake, James. She took her mouth away from his ear. At last, Bond's eyes opened between their puffed lids, and he looked up at her from the wooden floor and gave a shuddering sigh. Can you walk? Wait. His willpower had gone. He just wanted to sleep, or even to die. Anything to lessen the pain that was in him and all over him, stabbing, hammering, grinding him, and to kill the memory of the 4 boots thudding into him and the grunts coming from the 2 hooded figures. Directly he thought of the 2 men and of Mr. Spang, the will to live came into Bond in a flood, and he said, Okay, we're in the waiting room, whispered the girl. We must get to the end of the station. I'll have to crawl, said Bond. Follow you. The girl got to her feet and pushed open the door. Bond gritted his teeth and crawled out onto the moonlit platform. Then, with Tiffany Case's arm round him, he limped along the wooden boards. And there, in the single-line siding, was a railroad handcar. Bond stopped and gazed at it. Petrol? He said vaguely. Tiffany Case gestured towards a row of cans against the station wall. Just filled her up, she whispered back. It's what they use for inspecting the line, and I can work it. Hurry, get aboard. She giggled breathlessly. Next stop, Rhyolite. My God, you're a girl, whispered Bond. But there'll be a hell of a noise when we start that thing. Wait, I've got an idea. You got some matches? She dug into the pocket of her slacks and handed him her lighter. Bond lurched over to the row of petrol tins and started hurling the contents over the wooden walls and platform. Get her going. He bent agonizingly down and picked up a crumpled newspaper from beside the rails. There was the angry whine of the self-starter, and then the little 2-stroke engine caught and started hammering busily. Bond flicked the lighter. The piece of paper flared, and he flung it away from him amongst the petrol cans. The whoosh of flame almost caught him as he threw himself backward onto the little platform of the car. But then the girl let in the clutch, and the handcar started down the line. That was quite an exit, like something out of an old Buster Keaton film. How'd you feel? She surveyed the battered face. God, you look terrible. Nothing broken, said Bond. Suppose that's what's meant by an 80%er. It's better being kicked than being shot. The girl's face cringed. I just had to sit there and pretend that I didn't care. Spang stayed and listened and watched me. Then they slung you into the waiting room, and everybody went happily to bed. I waited an hour in my room, and then I got busy. The worst part was trying to wake you up. Bond tightened his arm around her shoulders. I'll tell you what I think of you when it doesn't hurt so much. But what about you, Tiffany? You'll be in a jam if they catch up with us. Oh, don't worry about me. First thing is to get this crate to Rhyolite. Then we'll have to find a car somewhere and get over the state border into California. I got plenty of money. Then we'll get you to a doctor. I got your gun. One of the help brought it over when they'd finished picking up the pieces of those 2 guys you wrestled with in the Pink Garter. I collected it after Spang had gone to bed. She unbuttoned her shirt and dug into the waistband of her slacks. Bond took the Beretta and flicked out the magazine. 3 rounds left and 1 in the breech. He put the gun on safe and tucked it into the top of his trousers. The miles and the minutes clicked by, and every now and then Bond turned painfully in his seat and inspected the blossoming red glow in the sky behind them. They'd been going nearly an hour when a thin, humming undertone in the air or on the rails made Bond stiffen. Again, he looked back over his shoulder. Was there a tiny glowworm glimmer between them and the false red dawn of the burning ghost town? Do you see anything back there? It's the cannonball, said Tiffany flatly. What can she do? Asked Bond. Oh, maybe 60. And how far to Rhyolite? Around 30. For 15 minutes they sped along in silence, and now Bond could clearly see the great pilot light of the engine cutting through the night, not more than 5 miles away. Perhaps he'll run out of wood, thought Bond. On an impulse, he said casually to the girl, I suppose we're all right for gas? Oh, sure, said Tiffany. Put in a whole can. These things will run forever on a gallon of gas. Almost before the words were out of her mouth, the little engine gave a deprecating cough. Put, put, put. Then it ran merrily on. Christ, said Tiffany. Did you hear that? Bond said nothing. He felt the palms of his hands go wet. And again, put, put, put. And suddenly they were freewheeling along in silence. A last savage twist at the accelerator and a kick from Tiffany Case at the engine housing, and they had stopped. Well, that's that, Bond said to the girl. Now, just let's think hard. He looked all around. No cover to the left and 2 miles at least to the road. There's a branch line just ahead, she said. If we can push the thing there and you can work the old points, he might miss us. My God, said Bond slowly. There's something better than that. Give me a hand. Once started, the car moved easily and they only had to keep it rolling. They came to the points and Bond went on pushing until they were 20 yards past. What the hell? Panted Tiffany. Come on, said Bond, stumbling back to where the rusty switch stuck up beside the rails. We're going to put the cannonball onto the branch line. Oh, boy, said Tiffany Case reverently. And then they were both at the switch and Bond's bruised muscles were cracking as he heaved. Slowly the rusty metal shifted as Bond strained and jerked at the lever. And then it was done, and Bond knelt on the ground with his head down, fighting the dizziness that threatened to drown him. But then there was a glare of light on the ground, and Tiffany tugged at him, and he was on his feet again and stumbling back to the car. And the whole air was full of thunder and the doleful clanging of the warning bell as the great flaming iron beast came roaring towards them. Get down and don't move, shouted Bond above the noise, and he thrust her to the ground behind the flimsy shelter of the handcar. Then he limped quickly to the side of the track and drew his gun. Only 4 bullets, and he knew where they would go. And then, 20 yards away, the flying engine thundered into the curve and took the siding with a lurch that sent logs hurtling towards Bond off the top of the tender. There was a glimpse of the black and silver figure of Spang, spread-eagled, clinging to the side of the cabin with one hand and with the other outflung to the throttle lever. Bond's gun shouted its 4 words. There was a lightning impression of a white face jerked up towards the sky, and then the great black and gold engine was past and hurtling towards the shadowy wall of the Spectre Mountains, the beam of its pilot light scything at the darkness ahead, and its automatic warning bell clanging sadly on, ding-dong, ding-dong, ding-dong. Suddenly, there was a great tongue of fire and a terrible iron crash as if a battleship had run on a reef. Bond heaved a deep sigh as if he was just waking up. So that was the end of one of the Spangs. Let's get away from here, Tiffany Case said urgently. I've had enough of this. Bond felt the pain creeping back into his body as his tension relaxed. Yes, we'll have to get to the road. It'll be hard going. Come on. It took them an hour and a half to cover the 2 miles, and by the time he collapsed into the dirt beside the cement highway, Bond was delirious. It was the girl who had got him there. And now she was cradling his head against her and talking softly to him and wiping the sweat off his face with the corner of her shirt. An hour later, she jumped to her feet and went and stood in the middle of the road. A low, black car was coming out of the dancing haze which hid the distant valley of Las Vegas. It rolled to a stop just in front of her, and a hawk-like face stuck itself out of the window. Keen, grey eyes glanced at the prostrate figure of the man in the dust beside the road and came back to her. Then, in a friendly Texan drawl, the driver said, Felix Leiter, ma'am, at your service. What may I do for you on this beautiful morning? Leiter had contacted Ernie Cureo in hospital and realized that Bond had been taken to Spectreville. So he figured that James might need some reinforcements, hence his timely arrival. He now drove them over the state line into California, where a doctor called Otis Fairplay attended to Bond's injuries. After that, he used the Pinkerton organization to get them a flight to New York and berths on the Queen Elizabeth. So, 2 days later, there they were in the great, safe, black British belly of the Queen Elizabeth, in their cabins on M deck with their doors locked against the world. But as Tiffany and Bond went into the mouth of the gangway, a dockhand had walked swiftly to a phone booth in the customs shed. And 3 hours later, 2 American businessmen were dropped to the dockside by a black sedan and were just in time to get through immigration and customs and up the gangway before the loudspeakers began calling for all visitors to leave the ship, please. And one of the businessmen was youngish, with a pretty face and a glimpse of prematurely white hair, and the name on the briefcase he was carrying was B. Kitteridge. And the other was a big, fattish man with a nervous glare in the small eyes behind the bifocals, and he was sweating profusely and constantly wiping his face around with a big handkerchief. And the name on the label of his grip was W. Winter, and below the name in red ink was written, "My blood group is F." For the first 2 days, the weather was rough, and Tiffany was told by Bond to stay in her cabin and live on Dramamine and champagne. "Anyway," he said, "it won't do any harm to stay out of sight for most of the voyage. It's just possible they picked us up in New York." When, on the 3rd day, they got together for drinks in the observation lounge, Tiffany said, "Now tell me a few things. First of all, who are you working for? At the beginning in the hotel, I thought you were a crook, but somehow, as soon as you'd gone out of the door, I just knew you weren't. Guess I should have warned ABC and we'd have avoided a lot of fuss, but I just didn't. Now, come on, James, start giving." "Well, I work for the government," said Bond. "They want to stop this diamond smuggling." "Okay, so, what are you going to do with me when we get to London? Lock me up?" "Yes, in the spare room of my flat." "Are you married?" "Nope. I occasionally have affairs." "Why haven't you ever married?" "I expect because I think I can handle life better on my own. Most marriages don't add 2 people together, they subtract one from the other." Tiffany Case thought this over. "Yeah, maybe there's something in that. But it depends what you want to add up to. Something human or something inhuman. You can't be complete by yourself." "And what about you?" "Oh, maybe I just settle for the inhuman. And who in hell do you think I should have married? Shady Tree?" "Well, there must have been lots of others." "Well, there weren't," she said angrily. "Maybe you think I shouldn't have mixed with these people. Well, I guess I just got off on the wrong step. Does happen to people, James, it really does. And sometimes it's really not their fault." James Bond put out his hand and held hers tightly. "I know, Tiffany," he said. "Just don't think about it. It's here and today now, not yesterday. How the hell did you come to be so good at handling cards?" "Well, I found my way to Reno. They have a school of dealing there, and I signed on and worked like hell at it. Took the full course. You can earn good money dealing, $200 a week. But don't get the idea it's fun. It reads better than it lives." She paused and smiled up at him. "Now it's your turn again," she said. "Tell me what sort of a woman you think would add to you." "Somebody who can make sauce béarnaise as well as love." "Ha! Holy mackerel, just any old dumb hag who can cook and lie on her back?" "Oh, no. She's got to have all the usual things that all women have." Bond examined her. Gold hair, gray eyes, a sinful mouth, perfect figure, and, of course, she's got to make lots of funny jokes and know how to dress and play cards and so forth. "And, you'd marry this person if you found her?" "Not necessarily. Matter of fact, I'm almost married already, to a man. Name begins with M. I'd have to divorce him before I tried marrying a woman, and I'm not sure I want that." "Well, what about children?" "Like to have some," said Bond shortly, "but only when I retire. Not fair on the children otherwise. What about you, Tiffany?" "I guess every girl would like to come home and find a hat on the hall table," said Tiffany moodily. "Trouble is, I've never found the right sort of thing growing under the hat. Maybe I haven't looked hard enough or in the right places. You know how it is when you get in a groove." Bond laughed. "You're out of the groove now," he said. He looked at her quizzically. "But what about Mr. Serafimo? Those 2 bedrooms on the Pullman, the champagne supper laid for 2. Before he could finish, her eyes blazed briefly, and she stood up from the table and walked straight out of the bar. Bond cursed himself. He caught up with her halfway down the promenade deck. "Now listen, Tiffany," he began. She turned brusquely round and faced him. "How mean can you be? Why do you have to spoil everything with an abrasive remark like that? Oh, James." Forlornly, she turned to the windows, searching for a handkerchief in her bag. She dabbed her eyes. "You just don't understand." Bond put an arm round her and held her to him. "My darling, I didn't mean to hurt you. I just wanted to know for certain. That was a bad night on the train, and that supper table hurt me much more than what happened later. I had to ask you." "You mean that?" she said, searching his face. "You mean you like me already?" "Don't be a goose. Don't you know anything about anything?" He looked quietly at her mouth and then kissed her hard on the lips. She didn't respond, but broke away, and her eyes were laughing again. "Take me down," she said. "I must go and rewrite my face." She paused and then put her mouth close up to his ear. "In case it interests you, James Bond, I have never, what you call, slept with a man in my life." Bond took her to her cabin and then went on to his own and had a hot salt bath, followed by a shower. Then he lay on his bed and smiled to himself over some of the things she'd said. There was a knock on the door, and his steward came in with a small tray, which he placed on the table. "What the hell's this?" said Bond. Just come up from the chef, sir," said the steward, and went out and closed the cabin door. Bond went over and examined the contents of the tray. There was a quarter bottle of Bollinger, a chafing dish containing 4 small slivers of steak on toast canapes, and a small bowl of sauce. Beside this was a penciled note which said, "This sauce béarnaise has been created by Miss T. Case without my assistance. Signed, the chef." Bond filled a glass of champagne and spread a lot of the béarnaise on a piece of steak and munched it carefully. Then he went to the telephone. "Tiffany?" He heard the low, delighted laugh at the other end. "Well, you can certainly make a wonderful sauce béarnaise." He put the receiver back on its cradle. It was 11 o'clock, and there was only a scattering of people left in the corners of the veranda grill. 2 of them were sitting close together behind the pink-shaded light. The waiter came with the bill, and their hands separated. The girl laughed happily up into Bond's face as the waiter drew out the table and they walked towards the door. "And now what, James?" said Tiffany. "I'd like some more coffee and a stinger made with white creme de menthe while we listen to the auction pool." "All right," said Bond. "Anything you say." The smoking room was almost empty, and they chose a small table away from the platform where the chief steward was laying out the auctioneer's paraphernalia. But as Bond gave his order to the steward, the doors leading to the cinema opened, and soon there were nearly 100 people in the smoking room. The auctioneer, a paunchy, jovial Midlands businessman, rapped on his table for silence and announced that the captain's estimate of the next day's run lay between 720 and 739 miles, that any distance shorter than 720 was the low field, and anything longer than 739 the high field. "And now, ladies and gentlemen, let's see if we can't break the record for this trip, which stands at the impressive figure of £2,400 in the pool." There was applause. "Who's going to bid me £100 for the choice of high or low field? We all know what that means. The option to choose the high field, which I seem to feel may be the popular choice this evening in view of the wonderful weather outside. So, who will open the bidding with £100 for the choice of high or low field?" "150, said a man's voice not far from their table. 160. This time it was a woman. Monotonously, the man's voice called 170. 80, said someone. £200. Something made Bond turn round and look at the man who had spoken. It was a biggish man. Small, cold, dark eyes were looking towards the auctioneer's platform through motionless bifocals. All the man's neck seemed to be at the back of his head. 210, said someone. The big man's chin wobbled, and he opened his tight-buttoned mouth and said, 220. What was there about this man that struck a chord in Bond's memory? He turned to Tiffany. Ever seen those two before? Nope, never did. Look like something from Brooklyn to me. Why? Do they mean anything to you? No, he said doubtfully. No, I don't think so. Any increase on £500? Said the auctioneer. Going once, going twice. Bang. Sold to the gentleman over there, and I really think he deserves a clap." The fat man lifted himself a few inches off his chair and then sat down again. "And now we must go through the formality of asking this gentleman which field he prefers. Sir, do you choose the high field or the low field?" "Low field." There was a moment of dead silence in the crowded smoking room. It was quickly followed by a buzz of comment. The weather was perfect. The Queen must be doing at least 30 knots. Did he know something? Had he bribed someone on the bridge? Was a storm coming up? Bond turned to Tiffany. "That was a queer business," he said. "Extraordinary thing to do. Seas as calm as glass. The only answer is that they know something." He turned and looked carelessly at the two men and then let his eyes swing past and away from them. "They seem to be quite interested in us." Tiffany glanced past his shoulder. "Well, they're not looking at us now," she said. "I figured they're just a couple of dopes. The white-haired guy's looking stupid and fat man sucking his thumb. They're screwy. Doubt if they know what they bought. They just got their signals crossed." "Sucking his thumb," said Bond. He ran his hand distractedly through his hair, a vague memory nagging at him. Perhaps if she had left him to follow the train of thought, he would have remembered. Instead, she put her hand over his and leant towards him so that her hair brushed against his face. "Forget it, James," she said. Her eyes were suddenly ardent and demanding. "I've had enough of this place. Take me somewhere else." They came to the door of Tiffany's cabin, but she pulled him away, and on down the long, softly creaking corridor. "I wanted to be in your house, James," she said. The last thing Bond remembered before the telephone rang was Tiffany bending over him in bed and kissing him and saying, "You shouldn't sleep on the hard side, my treasure. It's bad for the heart. Might stop beating. Turn over." And obediently he had turned, and as the door clicked, he was at once asleep again. And then the angry bell rang in the dark cabin. Sorry to disturb you, sir. This is the wireless operator. There's a cipher signal just come in for you. It's got an en clair prefix of most immediate. Shall I call it out to you or send it down?" Send it down, would you?" said Bond. "And thanks." There was a knock on the door, and he took the cable and sat down at the desk and set grimly to work. And as the groups gradually dissolved into words, his eyes grew narrower, and the skin slowly crawled on his body. The cable was from the Chief of Staff. It said, "Firstly, clandestine search of Say's office revealed signal from QE addressed ABC, signed Winter, advising of your and Casey's presence aboard, requesting instructions, stop. Reply addressed Winter, signed ABC, orders elimination of Case, comma, price $20,000, stop. Secondly, we consider Rufus B. Say is ABC, which is partly equivalent of his initials in French, thus A-B-Say, stop. Thirdly, possibly alerted by signs of search, Say flew Paris yesterday and now reported by Interpol be in Dakar, stop. This tends confirm our suspicion that diamonds originate Sierra Leone mines, thence smuggled over frontier into French Guinea, stop. We strongly suspect member of Sierra International's dental surgery staff, who being watched, stop. Fourthly, RAF Canberra awaits you Boscombe down for immediate onward flight tomorrow night to Sierra Leone, signed COS. Bond sat for a moment frozen to his chair. So somebody from the Spangled Mob was on board and travelling with them. Who? Where? His hand snatched at the telephone. "Miss Case, please." He could hear the telephone beside her bed click and then give its first ring, the second, the third. Just one more. Then he crashed the receiver back to its cradle and ran out of his room and up the corridor to her cabin. Nothing. Empty. The bed unslept in, the lights burning. But her evening bag lay on the carpet by the door, and its contents were scattered around it. She had come in. The man had been behind the door. Perhaps a cosh had fallen, and then what? The portholes were closed. He looked into the bathroom. Nothing. Should he call the bridge, give the alarm? A ghastly vista of explanations, suspicions, delays. My dear sir, that hardly seems possible. The polite eyes of the sergeant-at-arms, who would be thinking in terms of drunkenness and crossing in love, even of someone trying to delay the ship so as to win the low field in the ship's auction. The low field. Man overboard, the ship delayed. Bond dived for the passenger list. Of course, winter. Here he was, A49, the deck below, and then suddenly Bond's mind clicked like a computer. Winter. Wint and Kidd, the two torpedoes, the men in the hoods. Back to the passenger list. Kitteridge, in A49 as well. And the Red Wart, and Tiffany saying, "There's Screwy, the fat man sucking his thumb." And the two men in the smoking room cashing in on the death that had been arranged. The woman overboard, the ship stopped, turning, searching, and £3,000 extra to the killers. Wint and Kidd, the torpedoes from Detroit. The whole reel of jumbled pictures whirred through Bond's mind in a flash of revelation, and even while he was scanning them, he was opening his small attaché case and extracting the squat silencer from its hidden pocket. Automatically, as he took the Beretta from amongst his shirts at the back of the drawer, checked the magazine and screwed the silencer into the muzzle, he was weighing the odds and planning his moves. He hunted for the ship's plan that had come with his ticket, spread it out while he pulled on his socks. A49, directly below him. Was there any chance of shooting the lock off the door and getting both of them before they got him? Practically none. Bond wrenched one of his two portholes wide open. He craned down. 2 dimly lit circles directly below him. How far? About 8 feet. The night was still dead calm. Would one of their portholes be open? Bond dropped back into his cabin and tore the sheets off his bed. The blood knot, that would be safest. But he'd have to rip the sheets in half to get enough length. Bond put all his strength on the rope. Should hold. He set his teeth and threw the rope out down the side of the ship and climbed out head foremost. Don't think, don't look down, don't look up. Never mind the knots. Slowly, firmly, hand over hand. The night wind tugged softly at him and swayed him against the black iron rivets, and from far below sounded the deep boom and whoosh of the sea. Would the beloved sheets hold? Would vertigo get him? Could his arms stand the weight? Don't think about it. Bond shut his mind and watched his hands and felt the roughness of the paint against his knuckles, and his feet were as sensitive as antennae as they groped below him for the first contact with the porthole. There! The toes of his right foot had touched the protruding rim. He must be patient and let his foot explore further. The wide-open porthole held by its big brass latch, the feel of cloth against his sock, the curtains closed. Now he could go on. It was nearly over. And then 2 more handholds and his face was level, and he could get a hand to the metal rim of the frame and take some of the weight off the taut white rope. He listened, gazing at the circle of slowly swaying curtain, trying to forget that he was clinging like a fly halfway down the side of the Queen Elizabeth, trying not to listen to the sea far below him. There was a mumble inside the little room, a few words in a masculine voice, and then a girl's voice crying, "No!" There was a moment's silence, and then a slap. It was as loud as a pistol shot, and it jerked Bond's body up and through the porthole as if he'd been wrenched inwards by a rope. Even as he somehow dived cleanly through the 3-foot circle, he was wondering what he would hit, and his left arm protected his head as his right went to his gun. Crash onto a suitcase under the porthole, a ragged somersault that took him half across the room, and he was on his feet and backing, crouched low, and the knuckles were white with tension on his gun hand. The blunt, black gun stood at dead center between the 2 men. "All right," said Bond, coming slowly to his full height. "Who sent for you?" said the fat man. "You're not in the act." He was sitting sideways on to the dressing table, and the small eyes glittered in the moist face. In front of him, with her back to Bond, Tiffany Case sat on an upholstered stool. She was naked, except for brief, flesh-colored pants, and her knees were gripped between the big man's thighs. Her eyes were wild, like a trapped animal's, and her mouth was open with disbelief. The white-haired man had been lying relaxed on one of the beds. Now he was up on one elbow, and his other hand was at his shirt, halfway up to the gun in the black holster at his armpit. Bond's gun held the neutral space between the 2 men. When he spoke, his voice was low and taut. "Tiffany," he said slowly and distinctly, "get down on your knees. Edge away from that man. Keep your head down. Get into the middle of the room." He didn't watch her, and his eyes continued to flicker between the man on the chair and the man on the bed. Now she was clear of the 2 targets. "And there, James?" "Get up and walk straight into the bathroom. Shut the door. Get into the bath and lie down." She had stood up and was facing him. His eyes registered the red splay of a whole hand on the white skin of her body. Then she'd obeyed him, and there was the click of the bathroom door shutting. There was 10 feet between the two men, and Bond reflected that if they could draw fast enough, they had him bracketed. With men like these, even in the split second of his killing one of them, the other would have drawn and fired. While his own gun was silent, its threat was infinite. But with his first bullet, for a flash, the threat would be lifted from the other man. 48, 65, 86. The variation on the American football signal spat out of the fat man's mouth. Simultaneously, he hurled himself on the floor, and his hand flashed to his waistband. In a swirl of motion, the man on the bed swung his legs sideways and away from Bond, so that his body was now only a narrow head-on target. Thud! Bond's gun gave a single muffled grunt. A blue keyhole opened just beneath the peak of the white hair. Boom! Answered the dead man's pistol, fired by the last twitch of his finger, and the bullet buried itself into the bed beneath his corpse. The fat man on the floor let out a scream. His gun had only achieved the elevation of Bond's knees and was pointing futilely between Bond's braced legs at the white-painted ironwork behind him. "Drop it." There was a small noise as the gun fell to the carpet. "Get up." The fat man scrambled to his feet and stood looking into Bond's eyes with fearful expectancy. He stretched his hands above his head and slowly turned round as if to sit down. He stood facing Bond, and quite naturally he let his hands fall down to his sides, and the two hands, relaxed, swung naturally back, the right hand more than the left. And then, suddenly, at the top of the backswing, the right arm tautened and flashed forward, and the throwing knife bloomed from the tips of the fingers like a white flame. Thud! The quiet bullet and the quiet knife crossed in midair, and the eyes of the two men flinched simultaneously as the weapons struck. But the flinch in the eyes of the fat man turned into an upward roll of the eyeballs as he fell backwards, clawing at his heart, while Bond's eyes only looked incuriously down at the spreading stain on his shirt and at the flat handle of the knife hanging loosely from its folds. There was a crash as the chair splintered under the fat man, and a rasping noise, and then a drumming on the floor. Bond pulled the knife out of his shirt. He didn't look at it, but reached up and drew the curtain aside and threw the knife far out into the blackness. Then he carefully picked his way across the floor to the bathroom and said, "It's me, Tiffany," in a tired, flat voice, and opened the door. She was lying face downwards in the empty bath, with her hands over her ears, and when he'd half lifted her out and had taken her into his arms, she still couldn't believe it, but clung to him, and then slowly explored his face and his chest with her hands to make sure it was true. Bond collected her clothes from the floor of the cabin and gave them to her, and told her not to come out until he was ready, and to clean up everything and wipe every object she had touched to kill the fingerprints. She just stood and looked at him with her eyes shining, and when Bond kissed her on the lips, she still said nothing. Bond gave her a reassuring smile and walked out and shut the door of the bathroom behind him and went about his business, doing everything with great deliberation and pausing before each move so as to examine its effect on the eyes and minds of the detectives who would come on board at Southampton. First, he tied an ashtray in his blood-stained shirt to weight it, and went to the porthole and threw the shirt out as far as he could. The men's tuxedos were hanging behind the door. He took the handkerchiefs out of the breast pockets and wrapped them round his hands, and searched through the chest of drawers until he found the white-haired man's evening shirts. He put one on and stood for a moment in the center of the cabin, thinking. Then he took off the fat man's shirt and went to the porthole, and took out his Beretta, held it against the small hole over the heart of the shirt, and fired another bullet through the hole. Now there was a smoke smudge round the hole to look like suicide. He dressed the corpse again in its shirt, wiped his Beretta thoroughly, pressed the fingers of the dead man's right hand all over it, and finally fitted the gun into his hand with the index finger on the trigger. Next, he dragged Kidd across the floor to the porthole and, sweating with the effort, heaved him up into the porthole and pushed him through. Then he went over to the card table that stood, with the litter of an unfinished game against the wall, and upset it on the floor so that the cards scattered on the carpet. Surely the picture would stand up. There would be the mystery of the bullet fired into the bed by the dying Kidd, but that would have been part of the struggle. There were 3 shots gone from the Beretta and 3 cartridges on the floor, 2 of the bullets could have been in the body of Kidd, which was now in the Atlantic. There were the 2 sheets he would have to steal off the second bed. Their loss would be unexplained. Perhaps Wint had wrapped Kidd's body in them as a shroud before he pushed Kidd out of the porthole. That would fit in with Wint's remorse and suicide following the gunfight over the cards. At all events, reflected Bond, it would stand up until the police arrived at the dock, and by that time he and Tiffany would be off the ship and away. And now, to take the sheets and get Tiffany back to his cabin without being seen. Cut down the rope dangling from his porthole, throw it out into the sea with the spare magazines for the Beretta and the empty holster, and then, at last, an age of sleep with her dear body dovetailed against his and his arms around her forever. Forever? As he walked slowly across the cabin to the bathroom, Bond met the blank eyes of the body on the floor. And the eyes of the man, whose blood group had been F, spoke to him and said, "Mister, nothing is forever. Only death is permanent. Nothing is forever, except what you did to me." It was hot and sticky, and the man hiding in the thorn bush was impatient and ill at ease. This was the last time he'd make the rendezvous, that was definite. They would have to find someone else. Of course, he would be fair with them. He'd warn them that he was quitting and tell them the reason. The new dental assistant who'd joined the staff and who didn't seem to know quite enough about dentistry. The smuggler shifted his position. Where the hell was the plane? Then he cocked his head towards the north. Thank heavens. He moved round the bush to get the torches and the packet of diamonds out of the toolboxes. A mile away, the big iron ear of a sound detector had already stopped searching, and the operator, who'd been softly calling the range to the group of 3 men beside the army truck, now said, 30 miles, speed 120, height 900. Bond glanced at his watch. It looks as if midnight at full moon is the rendezvous, he said, and he'll be about 10 minutes late. Looks like it, sir, said the officer from the Freetown garrison force who was standing next to him. He turned to the 3rd man. Corporal, make sure there's no metal showing through the camouflage net. This moon will pick up anything. The truck was standing under cover of the low bush on a dirt track that ran across the plain in the direction of the village of Telebadou in French Guinea. That night, they'd started off from the hills as soon as the locator had picked up the sound of the dentist's motorcycle on the parallel track. They'd driven without lights, and they'd stopped as soon as the motorcycle had stopped. They had put a camouflage net over the truck and over the locator and over the bulge of the Bofors gun mounted beside it. Then they had waited, not knowing what to expect at the dentist's rendezvous. Another motorcycle, a rider on a horse, a jeep, an aeroplane. Now they could hear the distant clatter in the sky. Bond gave a short laugh. "Ha, helicopter," he said. "Nothing else makes that racket. Get ready to take the net down when he lands. We may have to give him a warning shot. Is the loudhailer switched on?" "Yes, sir," said the corporal at the locator. "And he's coming in quick. You should be able to see him in a minute. See those lights come on, sir? Must be the landing ground." Bond glanced at the 4 thin shafts of light, and then he looked up again into the great African sky. So here came the last of them, the last of the gang, and yet the first. The man he'd taken a look at in Hatton Garden, the first of the spangled mob. The only one, except the harmless, rather likable, shady tree, Bond had not yet had to kill. Not that he'd wanted to kill these people. The job M had given him had only been to find out about them. But one by one, they had tried to kill him and his friends. Violence had been their first resort, not their last. Violence and cruelty were their only weapons. And now here came the last of the bad men. The man who had ordered his death and Tiffany's. The man who, according to M, had built up the traffic in diamonds, organized the pipeline, and run it ruthlessly and efficiently through the years. On the telephone to Boscombe Down, M had been brief, and his voice had had an edge to it. "Glad you got back all right." "Thank you, sir. What's this in the evening papers about a double killing in the Queen Elizabeth?" "They were 2 killers from the gang, sir, traveling as Winter and Kitteridge. My steward told me they were supposed to have had a row over cards." Do you think your steward was right?" "Sounds possible, sir."
"Did the police think so?"
"I haven't seen any of them, sir."
"I'll talk to Valance."
"Yes, sir," said Bond.
"Anyway," said M, "they were small people. This man Jack Spang, or Rufus Say, or ABC, or whatever he calls himself, I want you to get him. As far as I can make out, he's going back down the pipeline, sealing it off, probably killing as he goes. The end of the line is this dentist. Try and get them both. I've had 2804 working alongside the dentist for the last week or so, and Freetown think they've got the local picture clear enough. But I want to close this case and get you back on your proper job. This has been a messy business. Yes, sir. And what about this case girl? I've talked to Valance. He doesn't want to prosecute unless you feel strongly about it. Well, she's been a great help, sir. Perhaps we could decide when I've put in my final report. Where is she now? She's on her way to London in a Daimler hire, sir. I'm putting her up in my flat. In the spare room, that is. Very good housekeeper. She'll look after her until I get back. I'm sure she'll be all right, sir. Well, best of luck. Look after yourself. And don't think I'm not pleased with the way things have gone so far. Exceeded your brief, of course, but you seem to have stood up to these people very well. Goodbye, James. Goodbye, sir. Bond looked up into the spangled sky and thought of Em and of Tiffany, and hoped that this would really be the end, that he'd soon be home. The dentist stood and waited while the rotor blades flattened and softly the great iron insect alighted. He watched the pilot climb down his small ladder to the ground. He was wearing a flying helmet and goggles, unusual. And he looked taller than the German. Who was this? He walked slowly to meet him. Got the stuff? Two cold eyes under straight black brows looked sharply out from behind the goggles. Yes, said the man. But where's the German? He won't be coming again. I am ABC. I'm closing down the pipeline. Oh. Automatically, the smuggler's hand went inside his shirt. He took out the moist packet and held it out as if it was some kind of peace offering. Give me a hand with the gas. It was the voice of an overseer giving an order to a coolie, but the smuggler stepped quickly forward to obey. They worked in silence. Then it was finished, and they were on the ground again. The smuggler peered into the patch of indigo blackness where the pilot stood with his hand on the ladder. I've been thinking things over, and I'm afraid... And then the voice stopped, and the lips drew back from the teeth in the open mouth, and the mouth began to make a noise between a snarl and a scream. The gun in the pilot's hand stammered 3 times. The smuggler pitched backwards into the dust, gave one heave, and lay still. Don't move! Bond's voice came over the plane with the screeching echo of the amplifier. You're covered! There was the sound of an engine starting up. The pilot didn't wait to wonder about the voice. He leapt for the ladder. The door of the cockpit slammed and there was the whir of the self-starter. The engine roared and the rotor blades swung and slowly gathered speed until they were 2 whirlpools of silver. Then there was a jerk and the helicopter was in the air and climbing vertically straight up into the sky. Down among the low bush, the truck stopped with a jerk and Bond leapt for the iron saddle of the Bofors gun. Up, Corporal, he snapped to the man at the elevation lever. Bond's feet settled into the trigger pedals, and now he had the helicopter in the center of the grid. Steady, he said quietly. Boompa! The spangled tracer swung lazily up into the sky just below the speed of sound. Low and left. The corporal twisted the 2 levers. Boompa! The tracer curved away high over the rising machine. Bond reached forward and pulled the selector lever to auto fire. Boompa, 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 boom. The red fire sprayed across the sky. Still, the helicopter went on rising towards the moon, and now it was turning away to the north. Boompa, boompa. There was a flash of yellow light near the tail rotor, and the distant bang of an explosion. Got him, said the officer. He picked up a pair of night glasses. Tail rotor's gone. It looks as if the whole cabin's going round with the main rotor. Pilot must be getting hill. Any more? No, sir, said the officer. Like to get him alive if we can, but it looks as if... Yes, he's out of control now. He's coming down in great swoops. There he goes. Bond raised his head from the grid sight and shaded his eyes against the blazing moon. Yes, there he was. Only about 1,000 feet up now, the engine roaring and the great blades whirring uselessly as the tangle of metal pitched and yawed down the sky in long, drunken staggers. Jack Spang, the man who had ordered Bond's death, who had ordered Tiffany's death. The man Bond had only seen once for a few minutes in an overheated room in Covent Garden. Mr. Rufus B. Say. The man who played golf at Sunningdale and visited Paris once a month. Model citizen, M had called him. Mr. Spang of the Spangled Mob, who had just killed a man, the final one of how many others. They watched the last bucketing lurches, and then they held their breath as the aircraft, seesawing wildly, gave a final tip to its nose and hurled itself and the threshing rotors into the ground. Before the echoes of the crash had died, there came a hollow boom out of the heart of the bush, followed by a jagged ball of flame that grew and billowed up into the air so that the whole plain was bathed in an orange glare. The officer was the first to speak. "Well, sir," he said resignedly, "that's just about that. Afraid it's going to be morning before we can get anywhere near that lot. Mind if we get a bit of shut-eye, sir?" "Go ahead," said Bond. "Better get under the truck. Sun will be coming up in about 4 hours. I'm not feeling tired myself. I'll keep an eye out in case the fire looks like spreading." Bond slowly took his feet off the trigger pedals and sat back in the iron saddle. Automatically, with his eyes still on the leaping flames, his hands felt in the pockets of the faded khaki bush shirt, borrowed from the garrison CO, for his lighter and cigarettes. And he took out a cigarette and lit it and put the things back in his pockets. So this was the end of the diamond pipeline, and the last page on the file. He took a deep lungful of smoke and let it out between his teeth in a long, quiet sigh. 6 corpses to love, game and set. Bond put up a hand and wiped it across his dripping forehead. So this great red full stop marked the end of the Spangled Mob and the end of their fabulous traffic in diamonds. But not the end of the diamonds that were baking at the heart of the fire. They would survive and move off again across the world, discolored perhaps, but indestructible, as permanent as death. And Bond suddenly remembered the eyes of the corpse, which had once had a blood group F. They'd been wrong. Death is forever, but so are diamonds.